Part 1. The Ghost of the Jungle. For 36 years, he ruled the forest. No crown, only fear. In the heart of southern India, surrounded by thick forests and wild hills, there was a village called Gopinatham. Life there was harsh. Crops wouldn't grow, water was scarce, and poverty was a constant shadow. That's where it began. A boy named Kusmunisimi Veerappan was born into this struggle in 1952. No one imagined that this quiet child would become one of the most feared criminals in the nation's history. As a boy, Veerappan herded cattle to help feed his family. But the forest wasn't just a place to survive, it became his teacher. He learned to track animals, understand their movements, and disappear into the trees. When other kids played with marbles, Veerappan held a rifle. At just 10 years old, he killed his first elephant. By 13, he was already learning how to use guns like a professional. His uncle, a notorious poacher, saw his gift and took him under his wing. Veerappan became more than just a hunter. He became a ghost in the jungle, able to vanish without a trace, to strike with precision, and to move faster than the law could follow. The forest wasn't a hiding place. It was his kingdom. By his early 20s, Veerappan had already killed, poached, and smuggled his way into infamy. But it was only the beginning. Over time, he would command a gang of hundreds, terrorize 3 states, and challenge the government itself. While the cities talked politics and business, in the forests, a war was quietly burning, and Veerappan was the name whispered in fear, the shadow no one could catch. What turns a boy into a bandit? What makes a man believe he can outwit an entire nation? This isn't just a story of crime. It's the legend of a man who became myth, and the jungle that kept him hidden. Part 2. A man who became the forest. He didn't just hide in the jungle, he became part of it. Veerappan didn't fear the forest, he understood it. Every trail, every echo, every broken twig spoke to him. While the outside world tried to find him with maps and weapons, he was moving like wind through trees, leaving nothing but silence behind. In the forest, he wasn't a criminal. He was a king without a crown, ruling the shadows, vanishing at will. By the late 1970s, Veerappan was no longer a lone poacher. He had formed a tightly knit group of followers, young men who admired his skills and feared his temper. Together, they moved through the jungle like a phantom army. Their targets? The most valuable treasures the forest held, sandalwood and ivory. The forest was full of ancient sandalwood trees, highly prized but protected by law. Veerappan saw them as fortune. With axes and saws, his gang harvested the heartwood, smuggling it through secret paths and bribe borders. But that wasn't all. Elephants, the gentle giants of the wild, were also hunted for their ivory tusks. It said that Veerappan made millions through this trade. His hands were dirty, but his pockets were full. Still, it wasn't just about money. Veerappan wanted something more: power, fear, and respect. And he got it. The villagers near the forest didn't report him. In fact, many admired him. He gave them money, food, even built homes. To them, he wasn't just an outlaw. He was a protector, a local legend. But legends have enemies. The Indian government began to notice his growing power. Task forces were formed. Officers were sent. Bounties were placed. Yet, every time they closed in, he slipped through their fingers. Because while they chased a man, they were fighting something deeper. Something older. They were fighting the jungle itself, and Veerappan was its voice. He was no longer just hiding in the forest. He was the forest, and to find him, they would have to tear the whole thing down. Part 3. A hero or a terror. To some, he was a protector. To others, a nightmare. As Veerappan's legend spread, so did the confusion. Who was he, really? A ruthless outlaw or a misunderstood rebel? That answer depended on where you stood. For forest officers and law enforcement, he was a dangerous man who had crossed every line. But for many villagers in the deep southern forests of India, he was a savior. He gave where the government didn't. He punished the corrupt. He became a symbol of rebellion. The police tried again and again to catch him, and they failed every time. Not just because Veerappan was clever, but because he had a network. Locals warned him when strangers came. His gang moved like ghosts, disappearing into caves, rivers, and thick green walls. Officers would spend weeks searching, only to return empty-handed, exhausted, and frustrated. Over the years, his actions became more intense. He wasn't just taking from the forest, he was now challenging the system itself. He began targeting officials. He saw them as enemies. And when one forest officer named Pandalappan tried to stop him, it didn't end well. Pandalappan was respected, brave, and determined. But Veerappan saw him as a threat, and when they finally met, only one walked away. After that, the story changed. Now, Veerappan was no longer just a sandalwood smuggler or an ivory poacher. He was something else. He had crossed into darker territory. Yet, despite everything, people still protected him. Why? Because he gave them something they couldn't find anywhere else, a sense of power. In their world, forgotten by most, Veerappan was proof that someone could rise, even if he had to use fire to do it. But with every year, with every act, the line between hero and terror grew thinner. Was he fighting for justice, or simply for himself? As the forest whispered his name, the nation began to ask, how do you stop a man who sees himself as untouchable? Part 4. The blood trail deepens. The deeper he went into the jungle, the darker the legend became. By the late 1980s, Veerappan was no longer just a name whispered in fear. He was a full-blown myth. A phantom in the woods, a king without a crown, ruling from shadows. But his actions had crossed a line no one could ignore anymore. What began as poaching and smuggling had now turned into something far more chilling. In 1986, Veerappan confronted a forest ranger named Chidambaram. Chidambaram was known for his courage, one of the few who dared to push back against Veerappan's growing control. But that bravery came at a cost. Veerappan struck, and he didn't stop there. Over the next few years, one attack followed another. Rangers, policemen, anyone seen as a threat was targeted. His methods were shocking, but precise. He didn't just avoid the police, he played with them. Laid traps, spread fear. The forest that once offered peace had turned into war zones. And he didn't act alone. He built a loyal gang, trained in jungle survival, armed and ready to strike. Some joined him out of fear, others out of faith, but all followed him. The government tried to respond. They sent in patrols, formed special units, but Veerappan always slipped through. It was like chasing a shadow. Each time the police closed in, he vanished, leaving only stories and sorrow behind. And yet, to some villagers, he was still a hero. He gave food, medicine, even money. To them, the deaths were unfortunate, but necessary. They believed he was fighting for justice, against a system that had forgotten them. But to those who lost loved ones, he was no hero. He was a storm that refused to pass. A man who had once hunted animals, and now hunted humans. The blood trail was growing longer, the jungle darker, and India was waking up to the truth. Veerappan wasn't just a problem. He was a crisis. Part 5, A Kingdom of Shadows. In the heart of the forest, Veerappan built an empire, not with gold, but with fear. By the early 1990s, Veerappan was no longer hiding. He was ruling. Deep inside the forest straddling Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, He created his own law. Police feared entering. Locals feared leaving. The jungle wasn't just his home anymore. It was his fortress, his court, and his battlefield. He knew every stream, every cave, every shadow. And more than that, he knew the people. He gave money to villagers, protected them from other gangs, and shared parts of his profits from sandalwood and ivory smuggling. To them, he was a strange kind of guardian, feared but respected. Some even saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood, despite the blood on his hands. But the crimes grew darker. Veerappan didn't just kill, he sent messages. He beheaded those he saw as enemies, ambushed police vehicles, and planted bombs. He kidnapped forced officials and politicians. In one chilling moment, he abducted and later executed a high-ranking officer, proving he could strike even at the top. The Indian government responded with massive operations. Thousands of officers, millions in resources. But nothing worked. Veerappan was always one step ahead, protected by silence, by loyalty, by fear. Informants were rare. Betrayal was punished quickly and brutally. Some villagers worshipped him. Others kept quiet, afraid they might be next. Even his personal life remained elusive. He married, had children, and kept his family hidden in the folds of the forest. But the man himself? He was a ghost. Reports came in, sightings, rumors. But every time someone tried to catch him, he slipped through the cracks like smoke. This was no longer a man hiding from the law. This was a man who made his own. A kingdom ruled not with a throne, but a rifle. A shadowy empire built on fear, legend, and silence. And somewhere deep inside that forest, Veerappan waited. Part 6, The Last Betrayal. One meeting, no weapons, just trust. And then, silence. The jungle had fallen quiet, but something darker was brewing. After decades of evading law enforcement, Veerappan did something no one expected. He reached out. A message arrived for Pandian, the forest officer who had chased him for years. It was short, handwritten, and chillingly clear. Come alone. No weapons. If you do, I'll surrender. It was the offer Pandian had waited for his whole life. Against the warnings of his colleagues, against the logic of every man who had studied Veerappan's brutality, he agreed. Not out of pride, but out of hope. He believed, maybe, that the monster had grown tired. That the chase could end with handcuffs, not more blood. On the morning of November 10th, 1991, Pandian crossed a small stream near the village of Gopinatham, unarmed. The sky was pale, the forest still, but behind that silence, death was waiting. A single shot cracked through the trees. Pandian collapsed instantly. Before his body hit the ground, Veerappan stepped from the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't hide. Instead, he did something few could stomach. He cut off Pandian's head, carried it back, and left it on display, a message to the state, to the police, and to anyone else who thought justice could catch him. It wasn't surrender. It was a declaration of war. News of Pandian's death spread like wildfire. India mourned. He wasn't just a forest officer anymore. He became a martyr. A symbol of law, integrity, and sacrifice. His funeral drew thousands. But in the hearts of those he left behind, grief gave way to something sharper. The hunt for Veerappan was no longer a mission. It was personal. From that day on, every bullet fired into the jungle carried a name. And that name was Pandian. Part 7, The Fall of a Legend. Even the most feared can fall. By the late 1990s, Veerappan was no longer just a bandit hiding in the trees. He was a symbol of fear that haunted 2 entire states. But symbols, like myths, only survive if people still believe in them. And the cracks were starting to show. He had gone too far. What began as smuggling and survival had evolved into spectacle and cruelty. He kidnapped high-profile figures like Dr. Rajkumar, a beloved film icon and household name. India held its breath for over 100 days while negotiations played out in hushed tones. The message was clear. Veerappan didn't fear the law. He wanted to humiliate it. But in chasing fame, he sealed his fate. The government could no longer ignore him. A special task force was formed, combining elite commandos from Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. They had one mission: bring him in, dead or alive. A bounty of 50 million rupees hung over his head like a storm cloud. The forest that once protected him became a cage, watched from all sides. And his people, his trusted men, began to vanish. Some were arrested, others surrendered. A few flipped, offering information in exchange for mercy. What had once been a loyal army of hundreds had dwindled to less than a dozen. Even his own brother had abandoned him. Veerappan's network of spies, his lifelines for food, medicine, and weapons began to dry up. He was a lion still growling, but in a jungle that no longer obeyed him. Then came his final misstep: desperation. His health was failing. He needed eye surgery. And for the first time in years, he agreed to leave the forest. But he didn't know the jungle wasn't the only thing watching him anymore. The task force had waited patiently, studying his every move. And now they were ready. He thought he was making a choice to escape. He was walking into a trap. Part 8, Operation Cocoon. The forest was silent that night. The ghost didn't rise again. October 18th, 2004. The end was near, but no one knew it, except the shadows. Veerappan, once the untouchable ruler of the forest, was no longer the same. His eyes were failing. His army had thinned to a handful. He was tired, wounded, not just in body, but in spirit. For decades, he had ruled the jungle like a ghost king, slipping through traps, mocking authority. But even ghosts grow old. And then came the perfect bait: an offer for urgent eye treatment, an ambulance, a driver he thought was loyal. What Veerappan didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the driver was a plant and the vehicle was part of Operation Cocoon, one of the most expensive and meticulously planned manhunts in Indian history. At exactly 10:15 p.m., the ambulance slowed on a dark stretch of road near the village of Paparapati. Within seconds, the forest lit up, not with fireflies or moonlight, but with red lasers and the muffled footsteps of armed commandos. Veerappan was surrounded. He didn't surrender. He never intended to. A shot rang out from inside the vehicle. Chaos followed. The firefight lasted only minutes, but it ended years of terror. When the smoke cleared, 4 men lay motionless inside. One of them was Veerappan. India exhaled. News channels erupted. Crowds flooded the streets. Fireworks lit up the sky not for a festival, but for an ending. The man who once made entire villages live in fear, who kidnapped, smuggled, and killed without hesitation, was finally gone. But in the stillness that followed, there were no clear heroes. Some saw justice. Others saw execution. Debates flared about the use of force, about the years it took, about the politicians who once secretly supported him, and about the communities who once celebrated him as a Robin Hood of the woods. Even in death, Veerappan was complicated. The scars he left behind still ripple through the forests he once ruled. Families mourn the officers he took. Villagers recalled the fear. His wife and children disappeared into obscurity. And treasure hunters, to this day, roam the jungles hoping to find his hidden wealth. But the king of the jungle, he never rose again.